Like all Nigerian elections before it, the Anambra State governorship election, which held at the weekend, was not devoid of hitches, threats of violence, and the usual hijinks. As a result, thousands of eligible voters were unable to cast their ballots on time, while in Ihiala local government area of the state, with over 140,000 registered voters, no voting took place in the entire council area. This forced the Independent National Electoral Commission to declare the Anambra election inconclusive. The commission also suspended the announcement of results, which already showed Professor Charles Soludo, the candidate of the All Progressives Grand Alliance, winning 18 out of the 21 local government areas in the state and leading his closest rival by over 50,000 votes. To conclude the poll, INEC said a supplementary election will hold on Tuesday, November 9, 2021 in Ihiala. Now joining us from Awka to discuss the conduct of the Anambra State gubernatorial election is Grace Jerry, convener of Access Nigeria, Disability Votes Matter campaign. Access Nigeria is a civil society organization and deployed over 200 observers in the state to monitor the election. Good morning, Grace Jerry, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's start with the main subject, INEC declaring the election inconclusive and fixing a supplementary election for Ihiala tomorrow. As an election observer, was also actively involved in this process, in Anambra State. What did you observe? What do you think are the lessons we can learn? How do you think that we can improve on this process? What are the big issues for you after the election?
All right, thank you very much. Speaking on behalf of persons with disabilities in Anambra State and the 200 persons with disability observers that we deployed to 200 polling units, basically to carry out a random sampling of the election and how it worked and how much provisions that INEC made for persons with disabilities. I would say on a general note, in terms of deployment plans for persons with disabilities, INEC to an extent made some reasonable accommodations and reasonable provisions in terms of deploying assistive materials for persons with disabilities. But as regards the utilization, as regards the the utilization of those assistive devices by persons with disabilities, that is where we have a bit of a challenge. That is where it just shows that we still have some form of work to do as regards training of, ad hoc staff, training of permanent INEC staff to administer these assistive materials to persons with disabilities. So I would say on a general conduct as regards how much INEC made provision for persons with disabilities, I would say that the community of persons with disabilities were not as happy as, or would say they didn't have much access as they would have, wanted. We found out that there were challenges to the polling unit layout in terms of abrupt floor level changes for people on wheelchair, the setup of polling units, the voting cubicle, the placement of the ballot box. Sometimes, the verandas of schools made it almost impossible for some persons with disabilities to, comfortably cast their vote without being assisted. Some, blind voters who were excited because INEC was going to pilot the use of the Braille ballot guide in Anambra's election. And it would be the first time that Anambra blind voters would be using the Braille ballot guide. But unfortunately, most of them said they didn't see this assistive device to even use. And there was communication gap between the INEC staff and, the hearing impaired voters for lack of the Form EC30E PWD poster that shows the day-to-day election voting procedures and processes. So overall, for people with disabilities in Anambra State, I think their expectations were a bit cut short because they went to the polls with high hopes. But I think overall, I would also say that it's important that the mandate of the Anambra people is upheld. And I think the reason why INEC is still going to be holding the election in Ihala is to ensure that, nobody is left behind, because that is what we promote in the course of our work with the Access Nigeria Disability Votes campaign, that no one is left behind. And I think it cuts across not just people with disabilities, but the Anambra citizens, that everyone, gets to exercise their franchise. Another challenge that we also observed in the general conduct is the malfunctioning of the beavers. We met a couple of people with disabilities who, after waiting for a long time at the queue, had to, some were even deciding to just go back home because the beavers machine was malfunctioning. And they just got tired of waiting in the queue and were leaving. But in the midst of, or in the course of all of that, some people, still stayed, and waiting to ensure that they cast their vote. And that was what, for us, it excited us because the PWDs were ready to exercise their franchise.
Yes, that determination is truly commendable. And as we're talking about Ihiala and how that has caused us to have a supplementary election, it must be noted, your comments must be given, the serious attention that they deserve. Persons living with disabilities also should not be disenfranchised. It's one thing to provide the equipment and what have you, but it's such a glaring oversight to fail to train the staff properly. And I think that's a really terrible indictment. It's very unfair, I have to state. But my next question for you is regarding security. There's been pretty much universal commendation of the security agencies and their efforts with the Anambra election. What's your perspective on that?
All right. So for security-wise, I would say they conducted themselves with, civil. Interestingly, I went to observe along with the 200 PWD observers, and I saw how much they conducted themselves at the polling unit, where they were just positioned at strategic points, not basically interfering in the how the people were conducting themselves at the polling unit. And I think the fact that they didn't have the guns, they didn't have, that on them, more or less like kind of calm the situation, calm the people. But overall, it's exciting that, they were stationed in very strategic points where, they were looking out to ensure that every citizen's life is well protected. And I remember we paid a couple of advocacy visits to, the security agencies, and we told them it's important to pay very close attention to the most vulnerable people, especially persons with disabilities. And, our observers generally sent in the observation to say, hey, nobody with disability, experience any form of violence. No person with disability, experience any form of harassment. The conduct was peaceful. The conduct was civil. So I would say overall, I give it a pass mark to the security agency. The fact that the lives of people were protected and any form of tension was doused. The fact that people, the police weren't carrying their guns on them. I think that more or less like kind of calmed whatever fear and whatever tension that doubt would have, raised in the hearts and in the minds of people. So overall, I would say that the security conduct was good. At least the helicopter kept going up and down, and I would see people look up, and just to know that, their lives are well protected and secured. Overall, persons with disabilities were protected, so I give it to the security agencies.
I want to talk about access to the polling units by PWDs. How was it like, because you have thought that there should be special provisions like ramps, like platforms at which they could get there, with wheelchairs and the likes. And also, prior to the elections, the sensitization network mechanism for persons living with disability, were they targeted messages, for persons living with disability as regards conduct? What's your weighing on that?
All right, so first I will talk about accessibility, because what our 200 observers checked, what they were going to be accessing and reporting to the data center where the polling unit layout, the setup of the polling unit, the election materials in accessible formats, and just checking the general accessibility as regards persons with disabilities. And I think about 54% of the 89% data that we captured showed that accessibility in terms of the routes leading to the polling unit layout overall was not accessible for persons with disabilities. A few of the polling units that I personally observed on my wheelchair, I also noticed that because there were abrupt floor level changes. In fact, at some point, people had to hold onto my wheelchair so I can move freely, to go observe this election. Another challenge also was the fact that these election materials in accessible formats were not adequately deployed, because what we did was a random sampling of 200 polling units within the 21 LGAs. The random sampling shows that deployment was very, very poor. And not just poor, but utilization was very poor, because just about 19% of persons with visual impairment had access to the Braille ballot guide. Now, INEC has made provision for these assistive devices. But what is the challenge? What has always been the issue where persons who need to use these devices are denied the opportunity to use it? It means the whole effort by INEC is being downplayed when the persons with disabilities who you make these provisions for are not able to use it overall. And I think in terms of priority voting, one of the things that INEC has promoted for persons with disabilities is, and of course the vulnerable group, the elderly, pregnant women and nursing mothers, is to give them priority voting. But I think what we experienced in Anambra was like a 50-50 opportunity, where some people were given priority voting while others were denied. A typical example at the polling unit where I also went to observe, I met a woman going back home. She was actually on her way leaving, a woman with crutches on both, 2 elbow crutches. And she said, I've been here since 10 a.m. and nobody is attending to me. And when she was leaving was like around 1:45 p.m. So she was at the PU from 10 to 1:45 p.m. and still has not been able to cast her vote. So we had to intervene on her behalf, and we quickly took her forward, reminded everyone, that she has priority to vote before every other person. And immediately she was attended to. Sometimes it has to do with the ad hoc staff not, remembering to provide that priority opportunity. And also the citizens who are in queue voting as well, who feels that, come, I'm here. Yeah, I won't let you, jump the line in front of me. So there's need for like a general sensitization where not just persons with disabilities, but the citizens will also know that priorities are provided for persons who are vulnerable, that as soon as you see them, you allow them come forward to vote. Another typical example was the placement of the voting cubicle on a veranda, which is high. And, in the course of our advocacy, this has been, on the conversation, on the front burner of our conversation, on and on, to see that if there is a flat surface, can you set up the voting cubicle on the flat surface? Can your setup be on the flat surface? While we saw that in other polling units, most of the polling units set up on the veranda. And a person with reduced mobility cannot go, it's difficult to go up the stairs. Like someone with disability, you would have to lift the wheelchair all the way to the veranda. And we saw a picture of someone with 2, armpit crutches who was being lifted. You would see a policeman, you would see the ad hoc staff, everybody gathered and were trying to lift him from the flat surface up to this corridor. Now, if there is an accident, it's going to cost a lot, to be able to, address that. So it's as simple as set up on the flat surface so that such people would not even have to go through like a degrading experience, having to be lifted up, and everybody was watching. You know, so for me, when we hold this conversation in advocacies, when we hold these conversations, maybe, you know, on how we can work closely, organizations of people with disabilities can work closely with INEC to ensure that these barriers are removed. I think it's important that we take this conversation seriously, such that, you know, everyone feels, you know, experience the human rights, feels like I'm equal, and don't experience any form of degrading attitude at the polling unit. Because the picture of this man was all over the place when he was being dragged from the armpit, you know, being lifted up the platform. It's as easy as setting up on the flat surface. So there is need for more training, there is need for more sensitization, and there is need for more collaboration. You know, INEC working closely with Inclusive Friends, you know, on organizations of people with disabilities. Let's work closely hand in hand to ensure that, you know, these processes are improved upon. 2022, Ekiti and Osun is coming. Can we see a better, you know, improvement from what has happened in Anambra towards 2023 election, you know?
Grace Jerry, we have just about a minute to wrap this up. Now, all of this is within the context of the rights of persons with disabilities. This administration, President Buhari, signed the Persons with Disabilities Bill into law. He has also inaugurated a National Commission for Persons with Disabilities. So inclusion, access, and all of that. What's your assessment, generally, beyond elections, of the efforts being made to ensure that persons with disabilities are treated as equals within the purview of the Constitution? And what should government do quickly?
All right, so for me, it's about, you know, continuous collaboration. Yes, while the commission is being saddled with the oversight, you know, function of ensuring that the provisions of the Disability Act, you know, are implemented, it's important that, you know, they are given all of the necessary support. We are talking about the implementation now. That's the implementation stage. That is where we are of the Disability Act. It is important that every form of support is given to the Commission to see that the provisions of this act are being, you know, become an action and not just a document that is on a shelf. I know that the Executive Secretary of the Commission has been doing a lot of work in terms of advocating to the MDAs, advocating even to corporate agencies, and of course organizations like Inclusive Friends and other organizations, even before the signing of the Disability Act by the President. A lot of effort have gone from us, you know, to MDAs. It's just to sustain that conversation, but it's about time that we begin to see actions in the MDAs in terms of employment opportunity, in terms of access to healthcare. We begin to see actions where we have access is being given, provisions are being made. It's time for us to begin to see it. And from the signing in 2019 till date, we can't even say that we have begun to enjoy what the provisions of the act are saying yet. You know, people are kind of like adesic about the implementation, but I think it's about time individuals, corporate agencies, MDAs take into action what the provision of the act says, and we're ready to work closely to give you all the the support, and, you know, even possibly design framework that would work with your organization, that will work with your agency, you know, as regards persons with disabilities, and how persons with disabilities can begin to enjoy equal rights as human beings with, you know, equal rights.
Thank you so much for your insight. Thank you so much. And we'll keep talking about this here.